Okay, let's look at Standard 15 Substandard B. Explain the domestic impact of World War I. That's what we're supposed to do. Now, before we get into this too deep, let's turn back and look at STEM. The student will analyze the origins and impact of U.S. involvement in World War I. This is explaining the domestic impact of World War I. What does this word domestic mean? That's something we need to talk about. Explain the domestic impact of World War I. So let's look at that real quick. Domestic, when we talk about domestic, we mean within the continental borders of the United States. In other words, in the United States during World War I, in the United States, or at home during World War I, at home back here in the continental United States. Examples: what's going on in Georgia, Ohio, New York City. And non-examples would be like over in Europe: Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Gallipoli, where that battle took place, in Berlin, Germany. In other words, if we were to use Google Map, okay, World War I was fought mostly over in Europe. Okay, when we talk about World War I in Europe, we would go into talking about this secret system alliance and how it broke down. We would look at the Western theater and the Eastern theater, and we would talk about trench warfare and all. And you could do that. Okay, but here's what we're talking about: is we're going to drag our focus away from that theater, and we're going to look at the domestic impact of World War I at home within the United States. What's going on here in the United States? What's going on in Ohio? Okay, Dayton here. What's going on in Dayton, Ohio? That's what we want to look at. In other words, what's happening within the continental United States? Okay. So that's what we want to drag our attention to, is the domestic. Explain the domestic impact of World War I. World War I, what impact did it have on the continental United States here at home? In other words, what impact did World War I happen on the United States at home? And it says reflected in. We're doing close reading here. Reflected in, and we're going to find three things here we know about: the origins of the Great Migration, the Espionage Act, and then the socialist Eugene Debs. So our focus here is on domestic impact of World War I. What impact did World War I have on the United States at home? And in it we have three elements: Great Migration, Espionage Act, and Eugene Debs. And we can see some political and social interactions there, especially political ones, and conflict and compromise. We see a few of those. So we're looking at these domestic things. Let's go to the Great Compromise real quick, or Great Migration, excuse me. Great Migration in the United States. Great Migration refers to the migration, and that means movement. We've talked about immigration, and we talked about migration, the movement of people. The Great Migration refers to the movement of African Americans. And if we look down here at what caused the Great Migration to happen, a lot of African Americans are going to leave the South and go north during World War I. And the reason being, some of the reasons or causes, is that Jim Crow laws in the South denied African Americans their civil rights and forced them or subjected them to live in extreme poverty situations. So during World War I, 4 million soldiers are going to depart for Europe in armed services and leave factories in the north, and leave them in a labor shortage in the north. So these factories in the north need people to work. So these African Americans who are being subjected to discrimination, their civil liberties and civil rights being jeopardized and being forced to live in poverty, are going to move to the north to fill these jobs openings slots. So 400,000 southern blacks moved to the northern industrial cities to find jobs. That's what we're talking about when we talk about this Great Migration, this movement of African Americans from the South to the north. And here's a map here showing the Great Migration, how the South down here in this southern belt here, and all these African Americans are going to leave and they go to Kansas City, St. Louis, Missouri, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Washington, D.C., New York City, Philadelphia, all these northern cities up here, and then the Midwest over here, Northeast and the Midwest. And we're going to see this movement. And this migration is Listen, we can look at little charts like this, and we can see some, like from 1900 to 2010. Let's look at 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. What happens here? African Americans as a percentage of the population by region. Okay, look what happens to the South. Look at that trend, 32.3 to 29.8, and it keeps on decreasing down to 19.2%. So we see African Americans leaving the southern region. Well, where are they going? All we have to do is look at which numbers are increasing. If we look at the Northeast from 1.8 to 2.3, 3.3, we see those numbers increasing. So African Americans are leaving the South and going Northeast. And to the Midwest here, we see those numbers increasing as well. And they're going west. We see those numbers increasing as well. And these things could be shown in different ways. Here's one that shows California, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey from 1920. It's got it color coded to 1970. Shows it increasing. The population in those areas are going to increase over those years. If we see here southern states, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, over the years we see them decreasing in African American population. So this can be shown in many different ways. Here's a map that shows the increase of population in the north in these northern cities here, industrial cities. And an artist's rendition of the Great Migration was painted by Jacob Lawrence, and African Americans here, and we see Chicago, New York, St. Louis, Missouri. They're flooding out of the south, they're heading north. So when we talk about the Great Migration, what we're talking about is this movement of African Americans from the South to northern U.S. industrialized cities to fill these empty jobs that were left by soldiers who went off to fight in World War I. That's the Great Migration. Okay, let's turn to the Espionage Act, because that's another impact of World War I on the United States. The Espionage Act, during Woodrow Wilson's administration, they passed a law. Section 1 here says that whoever, for the purpose of obtaining and respecting the national offense intent or reason to believe that the information to be obtained is to be used to injure the United States. In other words, anyone interfering with U.S. government or military would be arrested for espionage. And it imposed severe penalties for spying, for interfering with military operations, or obstructing the recruitment or enlistment of U.S. service personnel. And this is the last one we want to look at. Let's look at the text here of the Espionage Act, Section 3, Espionage Act of 1917. It says, whoever, when the United States is at war, that's important, is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States, enlistment, to the injury of the service of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of $10,000, imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. So the Espionage Act, the government passed this law that censored people and their speech, limited what they could say or do in regards to the government and to the military during times of war. And so the characteristics are censorship, arrest for speaking out against the government or military. It's illegal to tell people not to go to war after being drafted, and clear and present danger. Any language can be considered clear and present danger to the United States military or government. An example of the Espionage Act would be Alien Sedition Acts. John Adams administration. If you spoke out against the government, you go to jail or be deported back to your own home country. Non-examples are freedom of speech and press. A lot of people felt like the Espionage Act was a violation of free speech and press. And we see that there were critics of the Espionage Act with this artwork here, and it portrays that the Espionage Act violated American civil liberties, because we see the Statue of Liberty, the Espionage Bill is snatching that flame of liberty out of her hand, and that's what they're trying to depict, that they don't agree with the Espionage Act. And that's going to tie us into Eugene Debs, a socialist. Eugene Debs, the socialist, spoke out against World War I. He was a labor leader, and he is going to be accused of violating the Espionage Act. So let's see if he does. In Canton, Ohio, he in June 16, 1918, Eugene Debs says, "They have come to realize, as many as have, that it is extremely dangerous to exercise the constitutional right of free speech in a country fighting to make democracy safe in the world." What he's doing is he's pointing out some irony. You know, we can't have a constitutional right to free speech here in the United States, but we're a country fighting to make democracy safe for the world. He's pointing out that irony. And there's another irony here lying behind this. When he's making his speech, he's going to be arrested for making the speech. But anyway, let's see if he violates the Espionage Act. Here's what he says there in the speech. "The feudal barons of the Middle Ages, the economic predecessors of the capitalists of today, of our day, declared all wars, and their miserable serfs fought all the battles. And that is war in a nutshell. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives." And then he goes on to say, "They have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people." And then he says, "If war is right, let it be declared by the people. You who have your lives to lose, you certainly above all others have the right to decide the momentous issue of war or peace. They are continually talking about your patriotic duty. It is not their but your patriotic duty that they are concerned about. There is a decided difference. Their patriotic duty never takes them to the firing line or chucks them into the trenches. You need at this time especially to know that you are fit for something better than slavery and cannon fodder. You need to know that you were not created to work, and that you were not created to work and produce and impoverish yourself to enrich an idle exploiter. You need to know that you have a mind to improve, a soul to develop, and a manhood to sustain." So in that speech, did Eugene Debs have the effect of obstructing the military draft and military recruitment of the United States? Okay, and you can rewind this and listen and pause and look at the speech and see if you think that he did actually have the effect of obstructing military recruitment. And that's the legal question. Did Eugene Debs' speech, we should probably put, have the effect of obstructing a draft and military recruitment? Let's look at this. Or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting and enlistment service of the United States to the injury of the service of the United States? Did he? The government thought he did, and he went to court. The courts thought he did, and he received a 10-year sentence in prison for speaking out against the government draft in his speech, and they said he violated the Espionage Act. So, and even though many consider the Espionage Act a violation of the First Amendment, it was a law, and they said he violated, so he gets 10 years in prison. While in prison, he requests a pardon from Woodrow Wilson, the president who pretty much put him in there. And President Woodrow Wilson refused, and he said this. He wrote this in a letter. While the flower of American youth was pouring out its blood to vindicate the cause of civilization, this man, Debs, stood behind the lines, sniping, attacking, and denouncing them. The man was a traitor to his country, and he would never be pardoned during my administration. That was in October 1920. While in prison in 1920, Eugene Debs, runs for president. Actually runs for president and is imprisoned in Atlanta, Georgia, at Atlanta Penitentiary. And while running for president in 1920, he receives 913,664 popular votes. That's 3.4% of the popular vote. And here's a little cartoon put out. Anyhow, there are worse places than a front porch. Yours for the presidency, Eugene Debs. And here's his little button. As you can see, he received a lot of votes. This was the largest number of popular votes ever received by a socialist candidate in the United States, and he was in prison at the time. And on December 23rd, 1921, the guy he run against in the 1920 election that won, President Warren G. Hardin, actually commutes his sentence and releases him from prison. And here's a quote here. I'm not going to read it. You can pause it and read it yourself. And then he was in prison April 13th, 1919. He's going to be released after his sentence is commuted by President Warren G. Hardin. He's going to be released December 25th, 1921, 2 years, 8 months, and 12 days after he was incarcerated for violating the Espionage Act. Okay, so have we met our objective? Did we explain the domestic impact of World War I as reflected in the origins of the Great Migration, the Espionage Act, and the socialist Eugene Debs? I think we have. Ask questions in class, raise your hand, watch this video over. Good luck on the quiz test and the EOCT.